Okay, so we're going to go over notes over the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War is spread out into 3 different chapters within your textbook. It's chapters 37, 38, and 39. And while it's important to know kind of the Cold War as a whole, we're going to be using Vietnam as our specific case study in HOA1 of the Vietnam War. So to dive right in, the first section you guys were responsible for reading was titled The Vietnam Nightmare. And so we've got the country of Vietnam is under French colonial rule and has been for decades, since the late 1800s. This guy named Ho Chi Minh had been the leader of a nationalist movement who sought to get freedom and independence for Vietnam. And so he's attempting to overthrow that French colonial rule. And this goes back even to World War I. So at this point, we're talking the 1950s. But as early as 1919, Ho Chi Minh had actually gone to Woodrow Wilson when Wilson had proposed his 14 points. One of those the main idea behind those points being the idea of self-determination. And Ho Chi Minh thought that Vietnam would be ripe for that idea. But as World War II ended and the US and the Soviet Union settled into the Cold War, the anti-colonial Asian dreams had been dampened because typically their leaders had become increasingly communist, while the United States had been obviously become increasingly anti-communist. And so we were actually supporting French control of Indochina, paying 80% of the cost in 1954 alone under the precepts of the Marshall Plan, which we talked about, or you learned about briefly after World War II, and what the United States' efforts were to contain communism. So despite the fact that the United States is financially supporting the French control of Vietnam, their power continues to crumble. As Ho Chi Minh and his guerrilla forces, known as the Viet Minh, are fighting against the French. And this culminates in a French garrison at Dien Bien Phu being surrounded, and the French being basically left out to dry, because some within the United States favor the idea that the United States should intervene. However, President Eisenhower decides to hold back because we just finished a conflict in Korea, the Korean War, where we didn't want to get involved at this point in another conflict that didn't necessarily have a direct impact on the United States. And so at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Viet Minh nationalists were victorious. And so this led them to be able to get a seat at the negotiating table, where it was decided in Geneva that Vietnam would be halved at the 17th parallel. And so Ho Chi Minh would get control of North Vietnam, and then a democratic government would be set up temporarily in the South, with the arrangement that in 2 years there would be a Vietnam-wide election. And so this map shows that division. You can see here, this is the 17th parallel. So you've got your 20 degrees north, and then you've got your, it would be, what would this be, 0 degrees. So this is the equator here across the bottom. And so right here is where Vietnam is halved at the 17th parallel. Easy way to remember this. You've got Vietnam halved at the 17th parallel. You've got Korea, which was halved a couple years earlier at the 38th parallel. So if you're a Fetty Wap fan, you've got Trap Queen, you've got 1738. So the 17th parallel is Vietnam, the 38th parallel is Korea. And so the South was going to be set up, as I mentioned, a pro-Western government under a guy named Ngao Dien Diem. The D is pronounced as Z in the last Diem. And so he is entrenched in the capital of Saigon. That's a city we'll come back to, but in South Vietnam, you've got Diem in Saigon. Those elections that were supposed to take place did not take place. And so that's why you had North and South Vietnam still exist 15, 20 years later when the Vietnam War starts. And so the United States and Eisenhower are promising economic and military aid to South Vietnam. It quickly becomes evident that Diem is not a capable leader. The South is not going to stand on its own, but it was too late for us. We were already invested, and so we weren't going to back off from it. So that was your first section. The second section was foreign flare-ups and flexible response. And so we're fast forwarding about a decade to President Kennedy, who had moved from Eisenhower's and his Secretary of State, Henry Dole's doctrine of massive retaliation. And that doctrine was essentially the idea that anything, any little flare-up or anything where we saw communism popping up, to use every power behind it to eliminate it, to crush it. And so Kennedy wants to move away from that. And so his Secretary of Defense comes up with a strategy of what's called flexible response. And so this is, you develop an array of military options that could match the gravity of the crisis at hand. So you're matching whatever the crisis, you're matching the response to whatever the crisis is. Seems logical in theory, but we're going to see that it can lead to some problems. And in the third section, you have the doctrine of flexible response. And the issues with it is it potentially lowers the level at which diplomacy and talking would give way to fighting, shooting, and troops being sent in, because you're escalating to different levels. You're not just squashing the problem like you would with massive retaliation. And so this provides, and Vietnam is a prime example of this, a mechanism for progressive and possibly endless stepping up of force, and that you're just continually matching what the opponent does instead of necessarily eliminating the opponent. And so as I just mentioned, Vietnam presented proof of this. You have a corrupt government that the United States is supporting in the South that had been ruled by Diem since 1954 when Vietnam was divided. And so late in 1961, President Kennedy is ordering an increase in what he's calling military advisors. That's just a nice way of saying troops in South Vietnam. And so by the end of Kennedy's life, he had ramped up troop levels to around 15,000, and he'd done this to help protect South Vietnam from the communists. Now, the United States realizes that Diem's a poor leader, and so in 1963, they encourage a coup against him, and Diem is actually assassinated by one of his bodyguards. And so now the United States has created its own instability within South Vietnam, because you now have a power vacuum of who's going to take control in South Vietnam. And what President Kennedy said to the South Vietnamese was that it was their war, despite the fact the United States is becoming increasingly invested in that war. As I mentioned already, he had ordered more than 15,000 advisors to Vietnam. And so it was becoming increasingly evident that the United States was not going to be able to leave this conflict. And so this shows South Vietnam being propped up by the United States military. That's it for your first section over Vietnam. There will be several more.